we'll give that a couple seconds until we see if anyone else wants to join. So we're doing something a little different today. We had a tricky April schedule, and so I'm going to try to do buyer and seller forms together. Though Jenny, you've done.
Yeah, I just did buyer, but that's always good for you.
Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. So I might have you guys help me with something. So this is the listing contract. This is the listing contract. Is today technically seller bootcamp or buyer bootcamp?
It said both.
Good, okay,
Yeah.
perfect, that's why.
Yeah, it said buyer, seller
And that's
bootcamp.
why.
I figured you must be combining them.
And there's a lot of crossover, so that's probably why. So this is single-sided, this is double-sided. Do you want copies? Do you want copies of the paper? I don't think you do, and you already have.
I have copies of buyer, just not seller.
Copies of buyer, just not seller, so here's your seller copies. And then Hannah, would you like copies of the paperwork, do you think?
I'll take both.
Okay, I'm gonna then give, hi Amy.
Hi there.
I know you can't see me yet, but hopefully you can hear me. I'm just
I can.
gonna give this like one more minute to see if anyone else wants to join in. And while I do that, I'm gonna run out to the copy machine. So I'll be right back.
Jenny, I'm Stacy. Oh, nice to meet you. Nice to meet you.
I'm Hannah.
I'm like, I was looking at you when I walked in. I was like, okay, wait, really familiar, but
We both have our hair down this time.
I know.
And in person. It's nice to see you in person.
It's nice to see
you.
yeah, Amy, Hannah's in the room with us.
Oh, great.
We Zoomed with on Friday.
Hey.
Yes. Hi, Hannah.
I should have assumed you knew. I love sitting in on this just to, I've been in it once before, but it's always super helpful to hear what your broker is looking for when they look at the documents from a compliance standpoint. So, right, I like to just sit in and get it refreshed as well. Are you, I'm an agent? Yeah, I'm an agent, yeah. Congrats. How's it going?
Hey, how are you?
I'm Stacy.
I'm Gonar.
Gonar?
Yep.
Nice to meet you. Are you an agent?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. Been licensed since probably about a month and a few days.
Okay. I'm an admin.
Okay.
And Jen, right? Yeah, agent. And then Hannah.
Okay.
And Melissa, our broker who's doing the training, just ran to the copy.
Yep. I just seen her on.
Okay.
How was your drive?
It was fine. I had to start rating it.
Yeah.
Start rating for you.
Now I just started sprinkling Mary.
On the way back, I'm sure we're gonna be in the right.
Yeah.
Where do you guys drive?
I'm coming from Waterville, down by Faribault.
I'm coming from Mankato.
Oh, okay. So
Yep.
you guys are both in the same direction.
Yep.
My mom has a place down near Faribault on Lake Musaska.
Oh, okay.
It's like a
so
little-
kind of by Kilkenny that way.
No, well, I guess I don't know what the name of the actual property. I mean, do you know Lake Musaska? Yeah. It's like a co-op on the lake, but she has just like a little.
Oh, okay.
So she's part of the co-op, yes. So we go down there a lot. Yeah, I'm over on Lake Tatanka. Oh, I've heard that lake. Yeah, I've never been on it, but that's not the one that the state park is on.
It attaches to it.
Okay.
So you can get from Tatanka over there. So
Yeah, I can never say it right. Yeah,
it starts with an S. I don't know. I always say
Cicada?
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds right. Cicada State, yeah. I always say it wrong. We love to go to that campground on the other side of that lake.
Okay.
It's called Camp Dells, yeah. That's like luxury camping there, right? You know, because they've got all those. I mean, the camping is the same as any other camping, but they've got so many amenities for the kids. Like there's pool and driving range and tennis and shuffleboard and just there's just so much to do there.
And it's huge.
And it's huge, yeah.
Huge. We drive by it. We're like,
I've only been there like 3 or 4 times, but ever have kids saying we're bored.
Right.
When you say
Isn't it
that.
nice though, because you
Yeah.
want them to be entertained.
Yeah, there's almost too much to do. Sometimes being bored is a good thing because it grows your brain. Like when I'm bored, I have to figure out something to do, and then your brain grows. And so, but you don't get bored then. This is a lot. We like it down there. It's this area.
We actually have, I found it, so if you look off our back deck over the lagoon, and there's a road that drives around, there's a fishing pier. Back in the trees, there's a bald eagle nest. And I saw it now as I was like, okay, that has to be a bald eagle nest because it's so huge, right?
Yeah.
Back in the trees. And then we see flying. And so my mom and my daughter and my granddaughter, we took her out for a walk, and we're back there, and I showed my mom where it was, and here comes the bald eagle swooping in you're watching it land in the nest, and the other one comes out, and it's just like,
That is amazing.
yeah, we can see it right off of our deck, but when the leaves all come in, we won't be able to see it.
Well, it's not going very fast. It is real, real slow. Okay, well, that's for you, that's for you. Did anyone else join on Zoom?
I don't think so.
Okay. All right, well, we're waiting for the second packet to come out of the printer, but while it does, I'll just get started. So, hi,
That's
Amy,
something I
welcome.
can grab for you. I can just go do that while you're talking.
Yeah, that's really nice. That's perfect. So some of you guys have heard my introduction before, so I hate to be super redundant, but I'll give a little synopsis. My name is Melissa Johnson, and I am a mom of two daughters. They're 8 and 12. And I started in real estate right after I graduated from college in the summer of 2000. And the reason I did that, I expected I'd climb the corporate ladder. I graduated from U of M, but my in-laws suggested that I get my real estate license because they worked in construction and housing. And really begrudgingly, I did it. I thought it was a very unusual career, and it was not what I envisioned for myself. But all I had to do was work in one model home, and I realized by talking with the prospective customers who came through that you truly cannot sell someone a house. They sell themselves, and they just look for someone like you that they trust, that they enjoy the company of, to advocate for them and to educate them and support them through the process. So I fell in love with real estate, which I did not expect. And through the years, I had real estate teams, I worked in builder models, I exclusively sold existing homes. And then when those girls that I mentioned became the age where I realized that they needed me more for kind of their psychological needs than just their individual baby needs, I started realizing like, oh gosh, maybe I have my priorities a little out of line. And Olivia has been a good friend of mine since middle school, and she helped me get my priorities in line. And we found that this role here as the broker of this market center was open and would be a really good fit for me. So I get my girls ready for school in the morning, I drop them off, I come in here at 9:30, I leave at 2:30 so that I can pick them up, and then I am always working nights and weekends, so you can always reach me. But Monday through Friday, I'm available 9:30 to 2:30 for you to help you. And if you need me outside of those hours, I'll get back to you, and just sometimes a little bit slower. But because I had done real estate for 20 years before doing this broker role, I know what you guys are going through. I have been in your shoes, I figured it out on my own, and I really am enjoying this role here at Keller Williams, training and helping. One of the best lessons that I learned in real estate, and sorry that this is very redundant, so I'll be brief, but one of the best lessons that I learned was in a sales seminar. It was like kind of the height of the housing bubble. So it was like 2004, 2005, when you could sell a house basically to anyone. People were lining up at builder models to put their name in the lottery, to pick their lot, whatever. And so all of us realtors were feeling pretty confident in ourselves. And the teacher of this class said, so how many of you sell the way you want to be sold to? And I teased that it was like my daughter's kindergarten class, because it was like everyone in the classroom was like, pick me, because I know everything and I'm so good at my job. And he let everyone give their kind of explanation as to why they sell the way they want to be sold to. And then he said, well, then I'm gonna suggest to you that you're losing 75% of what could be your business, because if you only sell the way you wanna be sold to, you're not speaking in the love language, so to speak, of those consumers that are considering working with you as a realtor. And it was like the light bulb truly went off, because you're so ingrained in your own personality, you're so ingrained in the way you do things, the way you like things. You have to remember, whether you're assisting and talking on the phone or doing some sort of email communication, if you send them a whole book's worth of, these are the next steps and la 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 and on and on and on, if they're not of that detailed personality type, they may immediately be agitated with you and say like, oh my gosh, I can't even call her. Every time I do, she's on the phone with me for 20 minutes, but I only have 2 minutes. So you have to do a good job with your agents and also just gauging personalities of the prospective clients or clients that you're working with to make sure that you're speaking in their language. The acronym that this instructor gave us was bulls, owls, lambs, and tigers, and it's BOLT. So bulls are people like my husband. They're like, I know what I want and I can make my decision today. And then owls are people that are more like my dad, who says like, well, before I make this gigantic investment, I would like to know what the miles per gallon are on this and tell me more about the warranty program. And I think I need to think about this overnight and talk about it with my wife. Then there's lambs who say like, God, I don't even know if I deserve this. Is this the right thing? Decision. And then there's tigers, and some people say that I'm a tiger, but I think I'm kind of a combination of all of them. It's a little analytical. I can kind of make decisions fairly quickly though too. And the tigers are the ones who are like, oh my gosh, that's the granite that I see on Pinterest every day, and I love that fireplace, and I can't believe the backyard. What do you mean there's a community pool? Like, they can just make a decision, like based off of their heart and based off of emotion. So with those 4 explanations, I take the time to explain it today because it's really the only time that I have the chance to see you guys at the beginning of your career. And I want you to learn this really valuable lesson that I learned. But really the reason I take the time to explain it is I'm going to talk through these forms as if you guys are owls. And I'm willing to bet you're probably not all owls. So it's going to be painful. It's going to be long. It's going to be a little bit torturous. I sort of knew that about you. You're going to eat this up. And I don't encourage you to talk through these forms with every one of your customers in this amount of detail. By the time you get to these forms, you're going to know what their personality type is. You're going to tailor your presentation to either give them the highlights or hold their hand and give them every single detail so that they feel assured and so that they feel deserved. Any questions? Okay.
Can we just ask Amy if she can see yet?
Yeah,
Or do we need to
perfect.
switch it?
Yeah, perfect.
Amy, can you see Melissa?
Yes, I can. I'm right here. Yep.
Okay, good.
Okay, just wanted to make sure.
Awesome.
Thank you.
All right. Well, if you wouldn't mind running to the copier, there should be 2 packets that start out as agency and they're kind of thick. And then I think there's probably one on the top still too. Okay. All right. Well, buckle up. Grab a cup of coffee or something, because this is kind of a long and intense one, especially since we're going to try to cram in a couple different forms or a couple different buyer situations all at once. So I'm guessing most of you, if not all of you, have logged into the North Star MLS already, correct? Yes. Okay, good. Hannah, have you? Yeah, okay, good. So sometimes in this class I have to give a little tutorial of how to log in. Sometimes I have to give a little tutorial of how to create a form based off of a listing. I'm going to skip all that with you because you are already pretty educated. I'm just logging in and then I'm going to share my screen, okay, Amy?
That's great. Yep.
Copies of the forms, if any of you guys want to take them, don't feel like you have to. If you want to save a tree, you can just leave them up there. If you want them, you sure can have them. So if you have questions about the North Star MLS and how to log in, ask your agents, ask Jessica, the PC coach. But for efficiency and for the purpose of our training today, we are going to go right to my transaction desk. I'm going to get to my oh wow, I didn't expect it to be so far down here. A lot's happened since then. Remind me, Gunnar and Jen, have you done buyer or seller?
I've done buyer.
Done buyer?
Buyer.
Buyer, okay, so we're gonna go right into seller. A lot of these forms cross over, which is why I think it makes sense to combine these two today. So back on my Zoom meeting, I'm gonna share my screen. Amy, can you see a black and white form now that says agency relationships in real estate?
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. All right, this is the first form that you guys will start with either a buyer or a seller. This form is really important, and Jason Herkamp actually just gave me a really good idea last week. As realtors who hold our license with the state of Minnesota, we need to educate buyers and sellers about who we are, how we hold a license, and how we can interact with them or help them in a real estate transaction. Technically, by Minnesota state statute, this is supposed to be discussed with them at first substantive contact. Well, the word substantive could be interpreted in a lot of different ways. Is your first substantive contact the first time that you run into them at a cocktail party and talk a little bit about housing? Is it the first time you show them a listing? Is it the first time you go over a contract with them? That would be up to the judge who decides on it. But to protect yourself, first substantive contact is probably the first chance that you get. So in the case of seller, it's a really good idea to put it in your packet that you are going to bring to every listing presentation. Now, the beautiful thing about this form is it really warms people up to signing. It really warms people up to kind of the pace at which you're talking through all these important documents. And so what Jason and I agreed to is we think that at the very beginning of your listing presentation, you should say, hey, I'm a professional, I'm a licensed realtor. It's my job to make sure that you as a consumer understand what's happening here. I'd like you to sign this, and it says in bold, this is a disclosure only, this is not a contract for representation. So they're signing just merely that you've given them this education. Then what Jason said, and I really agree, you should just leave that form with them and take it, snap a picture of it, because then it's time-stamped, it's dated. You'll be able, if the Department of Commerce ever comes knocking on your door, be able to say, yeah, actually I did go over it with them. I've always put it in my listing packets and I've just left it there for them, and then I've had them sign it later when we sign the listing contract. But signing it right there and leaving it with them, I think is a good idea. But Minnesota law requires that we disclose the various different types of agency relationships we can have. So we can represent just a seller, which is what we're doing. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I'm coming to your house, you're considering building a home with, or buying a home with me. So I am going to, you're considering listing your home with me. This seller buyer is gonna throw me off just a little bit. But what the seller's broker does is puts a for sale sign in their yard, they market the house, and they advocate just in the best interest of the seller. There's also a buyer's representative, where the buyer is going to contract with you, to work with you, to search out and find a house. And you're going to send them listings, you're going to give them research and background on comparables and whatnot, and you advocate just only in the interest of a buyer when you make an offer on a house and end up taking them through the transaction and closing. However, it does happen where both you as the representative of the seller might meet someone in an open house, for example, and you would then meet someone who doesn't have a realtor. That person says they indeed want to work with you, they really like you, they like your personality, they feel confident with you. They want you, on behalf of the buyer, to present this offer to the seller who you're already representing. And that's what's called dual agency. But it doesn't end there. It is also dual agency if someone from Keller Williams Preferred Realty represents the buyer of this listing that you have. Because there could be a conflict of interest because you're kind of work friends, so to speak, and the brokerage represents both the buyer and the seller, both the buyer and the seller have to agree to it. In my entire career, I've only ever had one seller, it was never a buyer, because buyers, I think, believe that it helps them. But I've only ever had one seller say to me, I am not comfortable with dual agency, I do not agree to it. But remember, this is just education, this is just disclosure, this is not an agreement, this is just that they understand it. There's also something unique, it doesn't happen very often, but it's happening more now than it has in the past, because so many people are coming up with like, oh, I told my neighbors that I'm thinking of selling, and wouldn't you know, their cousin wants to live right in the neighborhood or whatever. So people will come to you and say, hey, you're a realtor, I just want you to do the paperwork, can you represent me in some other sort of way, and you would represent them as a facilitator. Regardless of what you do for them, whether it is very intensive and detailed or just as basic as writing a purchase agreement, and you act as a dual agent, a buyer's broker or a seller's broker, you do need to give to them these same fiduciary responsibilities. And you remember from your real estate classes, or will remember from your classes, that the acronym that they use to help you memorize these is OLD CAR. Now, I wish that the Minnesota Association of Realtors would just put them in that same order. They're just a little bit switched here, but you don't have to read this to them line by line. You can just use your memory and say, oh, that's right, I owe them obedience, I owe them loyalty, I owe them full disclosure, I owe them confidentiality, accounting, and reasonable care. What that means more specifically, when it comes to loyalty, you will act only in their best interest. You won't do something to the detriment of the other party. You will be obedient to them. So if you're representing a buyer and you've looked at a house that's $400,000 and they want to offer $300,000, it will very much feel like a waste of your time, but you need to be obedient and carry out all of their instructions that they give to you. Disclosure is really important. You have to disclose all material facts that you know about the house. So let's just pretend you're listing this house, but you also helped them buy it a couple of years ago. If you knew at that time that there was, let's just say, if you knew at that time that there was a radon test and that the radon level was high, but your buyers said like, oh, we'll just figure that out later, or, I just think that's kind of a crock, I'm not gonna do anything about it, I feel totally fine, I'm sleeping on the second story. When you go to list it, if they do not put in their seller's property disclosure that they have conducted a radon test and that they know that the level was found to be high, you must disclose that. That is a material fact that you must disclose. Now, if it was something that the inspector found where they speculated I think the grading around the outside of this house is, inverted and not properly draining, you do not need to disclose that because that's not a material fact, that's just a speculation of one person's opinion. But it is your job as a realtor to disclose and not disclose anything else that's held in confidence. So that goes on to confidentiality here. So it says that you as the salesperson will keep clients' confidences unless you are required by law to disclose such certain material facts, as it says there. You will also use reasonable care in performing duties as an agent. So if this seller lists their house and at the time that they've decided to list, you have that bachelorette party that you're going to in Cancun, it is your responsibility to make sure that someone is covering your business when you're out of town, because it would be not using your reasonable care if for 36 hours you didn't get back to the seller and there are people trying to communicate them, potentially with offers, doing home inspections, important things related to their sale. You just have to use, time is of the essence, you have to use reasonable care. And then of course you also have to use good accounting for all of the client's money and any property received as the agent. That one to me is always a little strange because we do so much now when it comes to transferring the earnest money that we do electronically. So there's not a lot of times where you're going to be physically holding onto a check of theirs, but you need to use good accounting. You as a realtor are bound by our realtor code of ethics, and you are not allowed to discriminate against anyone. But sexual predators are someone that you cannot discriminate against, even though it feels like maybe you should be able to. So this is going to come up more so with your buyers than it is with your sellers, because your sellers know the area in which they live so well. But if a buyer says to you oh, rumor had it that there is a sexual predator who lives across the street and over on the corner, you can't join in on their gossip sesh and say oh my gosh, you're totally right, I read that about that in the newspaper too, and oh my goodness. You cannot do any of that. You must instead say, I am not allowed to divulge that information, though I realize it's very important to you. The source in which you would get that information for yourself is the corrections website at the state of Minnesota. You would go to this website here. If you prefer, you can also call them at this phone number here. So like I said, this is something that I usually go through it, then I go back up to the top and say, so like I said, this is for disclosure only. This is not a contract, but I just need proof. My brokerage needs proof that I've gone over it with you, so please sign and date. And usually they'll be like, oh yeah, absolutely, that was really good education. I didn't know anything about that. Thank you so much. So then you move on to, and there's a lot of steps here that you guys are going to be taking with the seller before you get to the point of this listing contract. You'll have done, very likely a preliminary interview. You'll have talked with them and revised your comparables multiple times till you come to a price. But we're going to pretend you've gone through all of that and you've decided now, the seller has decided they want to list their home. So this listing contract is a few pages long. It's essentially a framework that we use at the brokerage. It's not so much used by the title company or a mortgage company. This is a framework that we use at the brokerage to make sure that the seller has given you permission to do everything that you need to do to get their home sold. So we are by definition listing that this listing contract involves the property located at whatever the proper address is here in the city of and in the county of, which falls within the state of Minnesota with the zip code of this. You would put in the legal description here that you would find from the county records, and then you would write in the seller's name here. Now, it's not super important that this is the seller's legal name. It's not super important that it has the middle initial. The more information, the better. As thorough as you can be, the better. But if you've gotten to know them as Jim and Susie and they're Jim and Susan, it's less important to have their legal names here. It's more important to have it on all the buyer documents because that is used by the title company and also by the mortgage company. So just do your best. If someone surprises the heck out of you and says like, yep, I just met you today, bring out that paperwork, obviously they're a pro. And you would say like, oh, okay, well, fantastic. I wasn't really planning on that, but I always keep a blank copy of my listing agreements here in my briefcase with me. So I'll pull that right out, Jim and Susie. So fill in their names here. You list Keller Williams Preferred Realty as the brokerage. And then you would want to make sure and put in the date that they're signing this listing contract here on line 9 and a date that the listing contract ends on line 10. Listing contracts can be any length that you wish. If you're working with a lamb, if you're working with a tiger, someone who's not really going to notice, we recommend that you have your listing contracts go for a full year, but they can be of any length. So if it's a bull who says like, I'm not gonna guarantee that you can list my house for a year. If you can't get this thing sold in the first month, then I'm gonna find someone who can. So in that case, or if it's perhaps an owl who analytically says like, well, that doesn't seem like a very smart decision for me to make to give you this listing contract for quite that long. I prefer to evaluate our relationship and determine how well it is going, and we can extend that contract at that time if it's going okay after 2 months or 3 months. So it can really be any length that you wish right here. It just has to have a start date and it has to have an end date for it to be valid. It also has to have a price in it for it to be valid. You'll learn later that a lot of people are signing these, a lot of realtors are signing these listing contracts, let's just say in January, but not intending to list their house for sale active on the MLS until May. We have a process for that where we call it a withheld listing. So in January, you may say like, well, we don't know exactly what the market is going to state for what the value of your house should be by the time spring rolls around. So let's just write to be determined in here, or let's just leave it blank. You cannot do that or it's not a valid contract. So you have to write some sort of price in there, then reassuring your sellers that you can amend this price at a future time should you need. So you have to put your list price in here. You also have to put the terms in which they would agree to sell their house on line 14. Any seller is going to accept cash, cold hard money. They're going to accept that as a term of the financing of the sale. Most sellers will also agree to a conventional loan, which is where they would put 5% or more down towards the purchase. But not all sellers are going to agree to a government-backed loan, which would be a VA loan or an FHA loan or a USDA loan. There are also some common interest communities, most often condo buildings or townhomes that are not approved for FHA financing because they don't meet all the minimum requirements that the government has. And so you have to do that research ahead of time before going into this listing appointment to know for yourself, because it's not likely that the seller is going to know. Those are just details that they probably heard at some point, but they didn't retain. So you need to be the expert, you need to be the professional who figures that out. I am okay with, yes,
Melissa, how would an agent find out for a condo, for example, that an FHA loan was not allowed? Would they call the
you have to call,
HOA?
yes,
Prior
you have to call the property management company that your seller has record of. And they're kind of notorious for not necessarily getting back to you right away. So I'm okay with you waiting to fill out all of these terms. If you with a bowl pulled it out that day and said, okay, I wasn't planning on doing this, but let's sign it up today. I'm okay with you filling it in later and even amending it later.
What was the listing sheet that they said?
I think so, yeah,
Okay.
I couldn't figure out what was what, because they're different.
because they both start,
No, but one's single-sided, one's double-sided, and the second document in each stack was different.
yes, okay, so here's the buyer, here's the listing.
Okay.
This should have been double-sided, but that's okay. Here's the listing. Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah,
Listing? Okay, perfect. Perfect. You'll also notice on here, it says that, one of the terms of this listing is contract for deed. It is really rare that you will come upon either a buyer who wants to use contract for deed financing or a seller who agrees to it. It's more rare that a seller would agree to it. But if your seller does agree to it, and here's a scenario. Let's just say it's a bunch of kids who are now putting their mom in a nursing home and they are selling their family farm on behalf of their family. Well, this isn't a person who is like selling their house to, selling their split to move up to their two-story with their growing family. This is someone who maybe doesn't need the money right now. So you open up your pool of buyers so much larger if you're able to sell your home with creative financing options. And there is a time and place for contract for deed. It would be a situation where you wouldn't receive the proceeds of the sale for a couple of years down the road. And that may work for some buyer situations. So in your lifetime of your career, you're going to experience sellers markets and you're going to experience buyers markets. And if you're in a buyer's market where it's harder to sell your house, you may want to encourage the seller to consider a contract for deed if that life situation works for them. And we will go over it today. We'll go over it on an individual basis if you have a buyer or seller who wants to utilize it. But just know that has to be written in here as a term if that is something that you agree to on it.
So what if you don't list that contract for deed and then your listing is a year out and then you get to 6 months and then now you want to start looking at the contract for deed?
That's a really good question because you can still accept a contract for deed even if you didn't write it on the listing, but it needs to be on the listing agreement and the listing input form for it to be advertised as contract for deed on the North Star MLS. So this is mainly tied to like how you advertise it, but you can still accept those things even if they're not on your listing contract. That's a really excellent question, actually. Going down on the listing agreement, you are now going to be signing, and the sellers are going to be signing a lot of different conditions and terms of this listing, and this just summarizes the generality of it. It makes them aware that you are going to be listing their home for sale on the North Star MLS. That is going to get syndicated to lots of other websites. We're going to be doing things like placing a for sale sign in their yard or in their window. We're going to be likely putting a lockbox on the front. We're going to be answering a lot of questions on behalf of them. But believe it or not, when I started in real estate, we didn't have all of our listings online. I also didn't have an online wedding registry. I know, it seems really foreign. So this is new to me since having my career. This is old hat to you guys, but we added this into the listing contracts because, as you guys now know, with everything being on the internet, that eliminates some privacy that these sellers had. So just because you agree to list your house doesn't mean that you agree to smear it all over the internet as available for sale as well, and there is a way to do both. So you have to ask all of your sellers if they indeed wish to have their home address placed on the internet. You also have to ask them, if they're willing to place it on the internet in general, if they're willing to have their address on the internet, if they agree to have this automatic valuation of their property on the internet, which is most commonly referred to as the Zestimate, and then also if they allow people to provide reviews and comments of their home on the internet. Now, they can check no to all of these if they wish to, if they're extremely private lambs, for example. But in order to do your job to your best of your ability, which is to gain as much interest in their property as possible, you are going to encourage them to check yes on all of these. Now, it'll be very tempting to say like, heck, no, I don't like those Zillow's estimates. I do not want them to provide an auto valuation. And why would I allow anyone to make comments on my house? Like derogatory comments that you can expect is, oh, I used to live next door to those people and I know that they never cleaned their house, or, they were always fighting, like they must be getting divorced. That's probably why their house is listed for sale. It'd be very tempting to say, no, thank you, please don't allow any comments on our house. But I will tell you from my experience and also my personal experience and also the experience here at the brokerage, it's very unlikely that there are going to be any comments placed online. So the pro and con as you weigh this yes to no, it just makes more sense to me to say yes. Otherwise, what happens, especially with this estimate, is if you say no, Zillow just automatically filters it out and says, well, then we're not gonna mess with you, so we're not even gonna syndicate this to Zillow. And that will be more messy and more challenging to unwind if your sellers change their mind and say like, wait a minute, I don't even see my house on Zillow. So I encourage you to tell all of your sellers yes to these things, but you have to give them the choice. You absolutely have to give them the choice. There's also a section in here talking about is the property going to be listed for lease, or is it currently being leased? Now again, in your career, it is currently a seller's market. The sellers get to decide exactly what they want to do, but inevitably, eventually, it will be a buyer's market. And there may be some sellers who say like, holy smokes, I just got relocated to Tennessee. I can't sell my house. I can't afford to keep the mortgage here. If someone wants to rent it rather than just buy it, like let's try that too. So you may be in a situation at some point in your career where you say, yep, this house is listed for lease and it's also listed for sale. The seller has obligations that they owe you when they sign this listing contract. And keep in mind, when signing a buyer rep agreement or a listing agreement, these documents are intended to establish a framework of what your agreement is. They're established to protect the seller, but they're also just as much so to protect you. And part of this contract will talk about protecting you. So the seller needs to understand, I'm not just listing your house, we're working in partnership and these are your obligations to me. So they need to provide you things that you ask of them. They need to make their house available. They need to continue to pay their association dues and all their utilities while the home is listed. They need to give access, like I mentioned, to the property for things like photographers, for inspections, for measuring and whatnot. They also need to understand that it is state statute that prohibits them from intercepting any communication that happens within their house. So it's very tempting to people to leave up their baby monitor. It's very tempting to people to, be like glued to their Nest doorbell. But if it is ever found that they were listening in, they would be in violation of state law. So we have to let them know it is in their best interest to avoid the temptation to watch all that or to record all that. Once you take pictures of the house, the seller gives us a license and agreement to utilize the photography of their house, so it becomes property of the brokerage once the pictures are taken. Then we go on to talk about the compensation. This is actually a pretty tricky part to talk about, especially if it is that bull who said like, yep, let's just sign this up today. So a lot of times I'll even say, hey, you know what? Let's talk about the compensation here in a little bit. I'm gonna go forward and I'm gonna talk with you about some of the other things. I wanna make sure that you know that the real estate commission that we're going to agree upon between you and Keller Williams Preferred Realty doesn't come just to me directly. It goes to the brokerage, Keller Williams Preferred Realty, and from there, we pay out a cooperating commission of 2.7% to the realtor who represents the buyer. So we're noting that here on line 47 that the broker shall offer a compensation to the cooperating brokers. It's 2.7 if the buyer is represented by a realtor, and it's also 2.7 if the buyer is just assisted by a realtor. So going back to that facilitation agreement, you don't have to represent someone to get paid. If they don't want representation, but they still just want you to assist them, representation would be giving them loyalty, obedience, confidentiality. That's a buyer representation agreement. But you don't have to have that buyer representation agreement to still be able to assist someone. It is rare that this happens, but it is important on your listing agreement that you check both of these. It's also important that you check on line 53. There's a couple other spots where there's like other sections that you can put it in as well. It's also important that if you have created some sort of creative little marketing agreement where, hey, you know, if I find the buyer, if the buyer is not represented or not working with the realtor, I won't charge you the full commission. I'll charge you a lower commission. That's what's called a variable rate agreement. You have to have that written in your listing agreement, and more importantly, you have to have it on your listing input form. So we'll go over that on the listing input form. But if you have verbally talked about at the time of the listing that you would agree to a lower commission, you have to put it in here. And who that really, really matters to is the buyer's realtor and broker, because if there's a multiple offer situation and the listing realtor has an offer, and 4 other realtors with different brokerages have offers, those buyers, realtors are gonna wanna know, hey, what am I competing against? Am I competing against a realtor who's going to be willing to reduce their commission and mine is guaranteed 2.7%? It's an unlevel playing field, it's unfair if it's not previously disclosed. So it's really important to do it in your listing agreements, and like I said, more important in the listing input form. We are going to be letting our sellers know that we are a licensed realtor, that we are experts in the field of marketing properties, listing properties, doing the basic Minnesota state statute forms, but we are not title closers, we are not mortgage companies, we are not tax assessors, and we certainly are not attorneys. So we can represent them to our best of our ability, but when it comes to the actual closing of the property, we are going to then refer that to what's called a title company. These expert title closers are going to prepare all the documents necessary for title. The property transfer is then going to be accurately reflected and reported at the county. And so if they wish, which most people do, if they wish, they will ask us to arrange for it. But when it comes to this section, I find, and it happens very rarely, but when it comes to this section, you've already talked about so much stuff, they're kind of looking at you like, oh my gosh, when is she gonna stop talking? And then it comes to here and it'll be kind of cute because they'll look at one another and they'll be like, ah, I totally forgot my Aunt Margaret is a title closer. She always told me if I'm ever gonna buy or sell a house that I have to close with her. And then you say, oh my gosh, no problem, you can close with whomever you want. Totally up to you, not a problem. I'm going to check here then that you as the seller shall arrange for the qualified closing agent. And the reason that's important is if they don't give you permission to send over all their really private and valuable information, contracts and ownership details, you can't just be passing that stuff on to anyone that you wish. You have to have their permission. And that's where line 164 is typically, and you must have them initialed here. I kick these back quite often for people who forget to have it be initialed. And then technically what that means is they haven't given you permission.
So about that commission, so is that 2.7 is like, if I were to sign a listing agreement with someone and I got the 2.7, then Keller Williams would take their from there and that 2.7. And then you just have the initials just because it's 2 people.
Right, 2 sellers. Yep, this would be for 2 sellers.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So So this goes on to say then that there will be additional costs in addition to the commission that we referenced above, and trust me, I'm gonna back up there. And this is just the way that I talk through it, and I find it to be helpful, not the way that you have to. But it just takes a little burden from like throwing off the, oh, and aren't I doing a good job? I cost you all this money. So I let them know here that in addition to the commission, there are going to be additional expenses that they may have. So there will be additional closing costs that they have to pay. There are fees that they have to pay to the government. There may be a fee that they have to pay to their association to prepare all the documents required to provide to the buyer, to educate them on the association. And we also, this is going to be likely the first, sometimes the second time that you talk with them about this. If you've gone over the property disclosure already, it's the second time. But this matters way more to the buyers than it does to the sellers, but we as representing sellers have to make sure and cover it with them. We have to ask them in their property disclosure, we have to ask them here, we have to ask them at the purchase agreement, are they a US citizen? And if we are, and if we know they are, then you don't even have to talk about it. But if you're kind of unsure, and there will be situations where you're kind of unsure, you need to ask them, and they need to be the one who put in all these check boxes. Because what happens, and why I say it matters to the buyer, is if a buyer closes on a property where the seller is a foreign individual, and the seller does not pay the appropriate taxes on the proceeds of the sale, and they just leave town, you know, they move to the Caribbean, they move to Switzerland, or they move back to their home in Germany or whatever, the buyer then becomes responsible for paying those taxes. And that would be a gigantic financial burden if there were a large amount of proceeds that that seller took with them. And we do not, under any circumstances, want to be a party to that. So it is always going to be whether you're representing buyers or sellers, it is always going to be our job to put the onus on the seller's realtor and ultimately the seller to tell us 3 times if they are or not a foreign individual. So then this is kind of a fun section because you've already covered dual agency. So you say, remember how I gave you all that education the first time we met, or just 10 minutes ago? Now you actually do, in listing with me, have to decide whether or not you would agree to allow me or my brokerage to represent a buyer that comes in. Like I said, I've only ever had one time in my career where a seller has said, no, actually I'm not comfortable with you representing a seller. Most anyone else is gonna say, I don't care if you sell it, I don't care if Mickey Mouse sells it, as long as it is sold for top dollar or at the terms that I want, I'm totally cool with it. So you do have to ask them. They will most likely say that the seller does agree to dual agency or that they don't agree to dual agency. Regardless, they have to sign here and you as the agent sign as well. We come down then to one last page of a lot of kind of miscellaneous things. So again, if you're working with a bull, if you're working with a tiger, you're just gonna say, this is a page of definitions and clarifications. If you're working with a lamb, if you're working with an owl, you're probably going to go through nearly every single one of these lines. Since I'm pretending you're owls, I'm gonna go through it. It says that the seller does have to understand that Keller Williams Preferred Realty may have listed other properties during the terms of this contract. I'm not representing you as my one and only seller. I may even have another townhome listed right in the same complex. We also acknowledge that both the brokerage and also the seller may have had previous agency relationships with potential buyers of this property. So, you know, the seller may know someone who wants to buy it. We as the brokerage may have shown a dozen townhomes to this one same buyer in the neighborhood. So there are certainly the ability to have previous agency relationships here. If this isn't working out, if we decide to terminate the contract, we can do so with a cancellation of the listing agreement, which is just a one-page form that we actually use for a lot of other things, but it can be only canceled with mutual agreement. So just because the seller insists they want to cancel it, the brokerage doesn't have to agree to that. Now, we believe in good customer service, so we probably will. Indemnification. This holds you as the realtor and also as the brokerage harmless of any claims of liability, damage, or loss arising from any misstatement or misrepresentation or omissions of fact. So though we are signing a commitment and agreement, we are essentially held harmless if anything not to our knowledge comes up. Seller understands that the seller shall not be able to discriminate against anyone, specifically to the protected classes that we have in the United States of America, and also those that are unique here in Minnesota, and those are listed out. There may be some additional terms and notices, and so the seller is agreeing to us that as of the date of this contract, that they do not know of any gigantic special assessments from their municipality, from their county, from their association. But if during the time of the listing they do receive that, they need to notify us immediately. They can't hide it and pretend it doesn't exist. They absolutely must present it to us right away. The seller is giving us permission to communicate with them in a lot of different ways, texting, emails, phone calls. Those types of oral communication are not necessarily agreement. The only aspects of the written contract, not verbal agreements, are going to be on paper and signed by both the buyer and the seller. Once we are asking them for signatures, if we ask them to sign electronically, those are deemed to be just as valid and binding as anything that they sign in ink. And like I said, they give us permission to communicate with them in all these different forms. So Mr. and Mrs. Seller, as I went over with you in my marketing packet, this is the listing agreement, but there's also a marketing agreement that I have with you. You thoroughly understand all the services that I'm going to provide to you to market your home in the best light possible. And so as we've talked about before when we've reviewed the net sheet and other negotiations that we've had, you understand that the listing commission for helping you sell your home with me and Keller Williams Preferred Realty is 6%. Does that make sense? Do you have any questions? Does that seem fair? Most people are going to say, yep, absolutely. And then we've reflected it back up here on the 6%. Now that you've talked through more things, it seems a little bit more worthy. And so that's why I like to skip over it initially and then piggyback to it. And if they agree to it, then I say, fantastic. I'm going to have you sign here then, accepting this listing contract. And I sign and date here as well. One other thing that didn't roll off my tongue so easily, but is incredibly important that you disclose to them, is in addition to their commission, however you negotiate that out, you also have a one-time fee called a broker administrative compensation, BAC, that you are going to charge to them as a part of their closing costs. It doesn't come to you. It doesn't come to me as the broker, it comes to the brokerage, and it allows the brokerage to provide services like front desk. It allows us to hire a virtual assistant to help with things at evenings and weekends. We keep the lights on, we pay, for liability insurance and all kinds of things with that fee. It used to be, before this form was revised, that there was a percentage line like this, and then also a dollar sign underneath it. There isn't anymore, so for those owls, it may be frustrating to write 6% plus $4.99. So if it is your preference, you can write 6% here, and then down in the other section, you can write seller to pay a one-time additional brokerage commission of $4.99 at the time of closing as a part of their closing costs. That just gives a little more definition as to what the $4.99 is, why it's there, when it's paid. I'm okay with putting it in either location, whatever your preference is. Note here though that I did write, should dual agency exist, commission rate shall be negotiable. And I mentioned that you can write that in a few different spots. So this is one here on line 122. It can also be here on line 153, or it can be down here on line 245, wherever you put it, as long as, if you talked about it with them, if you have a mutual agreement on changing the commission rate, if there's not another realtor involved, that you write it somewhere. Any questions? Okay, I'm going to go through these two forms pretty quickly because these are used for both buyers and sellers, and you guys have seen this form already in your buyer bootcamp. But this is something that Keller Williams has put together. It is not, these items are not listed in the Minnesota Association of Realtors standard forms, but these are important aspects that we want to make sure that our sellers and our buyers have reviewed with us as the experts, with us as the realtors. And so, again, because I'm pretending you guys are owls, I'm gonna go through it thoroughly. I'm just not gonna go through it as thoroughly as I sometimes do when I'm not blending these two together. So it is a requirement that a seller puts together some sort of formal disclosure on their property. You guys, as the sellers of this home, I've provided you this Minnesota State statute form, and I've asked you to fill it out to the best of your ability. A seller can just fill out a one sheet of notebook paper. They can do a home inspection, they can have an attorney write it up for them, they can do any sort of disclosure that they want. We've just given them a format to use that the Minnesota Association of Realtors supports, but they have to disclose something. It is also important for sellers to note that the buyer of their house is likely going to request that the purchase be contingent upon a home inspection. A third-party outside source, home inspector, not licensed with the state of Minnesota, is going to come in. They are going to do a thorough review of the house, and then the buyers can choose to do with that information whatever they wish. But we want our sellers to understand that a home inspector is different than a home appraiser, and that as a result of that, or maybe just in addition to that, the buyers may ask them to provide a home warranty on their house. They can also choose to simply offer a home warranty if they want to, and you guys as the realtors and the experts will form a way of describing all of that to them. Sometimes you'll have talked about it before this form, sometimes after, sometimes this is a catalyst for it, but home warranties and home inspections are separate from the listing agreement. There's also a high likelihood in this time and place in our world and society that there may be a multiple offer situation. For a seller, that's an awesome thing, but some sellers do not want to divulge the existence, that's the key word in this sentence, of additional offers to other prospective buyers and agents. I, for the life of me, really can't think of a situation of that, except if this seller is an extreme bull who just wants to play hardball and wants to, be like a wannabe poker player or something. Most sellers are going to say, yeah, absolutely. If we have another offer on this house, there will be fear of loss, and you can tell everyone. Don't tell the terms of it, but let everyone know that there are multiple offers. Where this is more important really is the buyer has to understand it's entirely the seller's choice to divulge the existence of an offer or any other details of the offer, and that you can't blame me as your buyer's agent if I can't get more information than you're looking for. It's also important for sellers and buyers to know if the property they're selling or buying is within a part of a community association, that there's a fee to compile and put together all the information on that association, and it's the seller's responsibility usually to do that. And that the buyer has to acknowledge if they agree to buy a house within an association, there may be some rules and regulations that they just have to live with because they're buying within an association. I have tried for the last year to get this form tweaked because it really drives me bananas. See, that's the owl in me, I'm a combo of all of them, that this tax deferred exchange heading is on this page and that the actual paragraph is down here, and that also you skip ahead to talk about capital gains and again, tax deferred exchanges. So I just talk through it in a way where I go down and come back up. I don't even address that tax deferred exchange is right here. I go right on to say, I am a licensed realtor. I hold my license with the state of Minnesota. I am an expert in the field of real estate and marketing it, but I'm not an expert when it comes to building inspections, tax advice, accounting, appraisals, legal advice, environmental issues, zoning issues. And so there may be some cases, though you are paying me to be your realtor, there may be some cases where you also have to pay to receive this type of expert advice. I'm also not an expert when it comes to tax deferred exchanges or capital gains taxes. So if a situation comes up where you have questions about your capital gains on this property, I strongly encourage you to talk directly with an accountant or your accountant. People will occasionally then look at you and say like, oh, 1031 exchange, tax deferred exchange. I'm selling my house, but I hadn't really even thought about doing that. What can you tell me about it? Now you're gonna wanna research it, you're gonna want to be knowledgeable about it. But if they do decide to conduct a 1031 exchange, they have to hire a 1031 exchange company to do that. It's kind of almost like a middleman, a clearinghouse, because there are federal laws about how you have to identify a property and the timing of all of it. So we can't go in and pretend we know that. We have to refer them to a 1031 exchange company. But what you can tell them is that as long as they've lived in their home for 2 years out of the last 5, as long as it has been their primary residence, so I've owned this home or lived in this home, they're the ones who have to be on the fringe of that gray of it. There's a lot of snowbirds who try to figure out a way to do this. But as long as they've lived there for 2 out of the last years and lived in it, making it their primary residence, they can take the proceeds of the sale and they can take that tax-free up to $250,000 as an individual or $500,000 as a married couple. If they haven't lived there for 2 out of the last 5 years, then it's treated as if they won $500,000 at the casino. They are taxed and they don't get to take all $500,000. And as you can imagine, that would be a pretty big tax bill for someone who has a lot of equity, which is why people start thinking about help me figure out how to either turn this into my next primary residence or turn it into my next investment or whatnot. That's why it's referred to in here. And that's why it's important to talk about it with sellers. It's not as important to talk about it with buyers, because if a buyer is coming to you conducting a 1031 exchange, they'll have already told you about that. They'll have made that perfectly clear. I think it's really important to tell sellers in particular that once we come to a contractual closing date, it's our target date. It is going to be met 95% of the time, but there are going to be some circumstances completely out of our control where the closing date is not able to be met. It's going to be incredibly frustrated because you'll have been packed up, you'll have been cleaned out, and you probably even are turning the proceeds of this sale over into another sale. But it's not going to be something that you can point blame to Keller Williams Preferred Realty on. There's a lot of other moving parts and a lot of other pieces. Another really important thing to remind them, and you may even have to pull this back out when they're in the stress of packing and moving, and say, hey, the buyer of your house is entitled to a final walkthrough. So they're gonna come through either like the day or the week before closing. Most likely they'll come through the morning of closing. They have the chance to walk through before they sign on the dotted line saying, yep, this is the condition of the house. It's substantially the same condition as it was when I bought it, and I agree to buy it in this current condition. It's frustrating to a seller who is stressfully trying to pack all their last minute things into these disorganized boxes, but it's just a part of the process. They absolutely have to do it. So these are all really valuable little additional provisions and nuggets and tidbits that Keller Williams Preferred Realty has learned through the years that they want to pass on to buyers and sellers. So I personally feel like it's one of the most valuable documents that you'll go through with buyers and sellers. The rest of it is standard legal jargon, can't really be changed. That one I think is a wealth of knowledge based on my last year's experience. One more form and then we'll take a little mini break. Have you guys ever bought a brand new car and they said to you, now we need to let you know that Ford owns Ford Motor Company, we also own Ford Warranty Company, and we own Ford Finance and blah, 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 blah. Sign here that you understand that all of those businesses may have some common ownership to protect you as the consumer. You deserve to be educated on that. Well, our industry is exactly the same. When one individual has ownership in a company where other companies that they also have ownership in, doesn't even have to be full ownership, just a little ownership, you as the consumer deserve to be informed. So Keller Williams Preferred Realty is owned by a group of people. They're kind of like the man behind the curtain. They don't come around a lot, not everyone knows who they are, and you don't need to. But some of those are savvy business people, and they may have ownership interest in the title company called Minnesota Title. They may have ownership interest in New American Funding. And because Keller Williams is a franchise and is partly owned then by Keller Williams International, there's also something called Keller Mortgage LLC. You as the buyer and seller don't have to work with any of these companies. So So it makes that perfectly clear here in bold and capital and underlined that you are not required to use any of these listed providers. You just need to be educated that you have the right to choose your services. If you choose one of these companies, there may be some common interest in both of them or all of them. All right, so before we go to the residential input form and a couple other listing documents, I'm gonna offer you guys the chance to run to the restroom, freshen up your coffee, grab a drink of water. I'm just gonna check my phone and I'd say it's 11:07, so let's try to meet back at like 11:11. I know that's only 4 minutes, but try to do it quick, okay? I'm gonna check your guys' forms. I can use the restroom, which is like a freaking miracle in itself. I just wanna check your forms and make sure you have everything. So you have all this, you have the seller docs here.
Yeah,
right?
that's the
Okay, perfect. So none of that seems confusing. And then I think you have the buyer and the seller docs. And but you already have a copy of the buyer docs, so do you want this? These buyer
I
representation
don't think I have a
forms?
copy of these.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Then they keep it. Okay, that's perfect. Hannah has what she needs. Amy, how are things going?
How do you want me to go about these, so these RASM forms?
Yeah.
Do you want me to, she said that I'll be able to just email it back to the same email here?
The data. Yeah, this is.
So she said something like,
Do you know how to set it up?
I'm not sure.
Okay, that's okay. Let's just print it off then.
Okay.
Can you print from here?
I'm not set up for it yet.
That's
I can
okay, just
email
forward
you
it to me. Yeah,
Okay.
forward it to me and then I'll print it. So it's Melissa. Yep,
Right here.
perfect. Yep, and then right after this, we'll do it, okay?
Okay.
So I have to sneak out in like half an hour, so I didn't want to be rude, but just wanted to let you know.
No problem at all.
And then I had one question.
Yeah.
When a listing contract expires, do you have to send all of the documents again or just the contract itself? Or does it depend?
Let me think about that.
Okay.
So when the listing contract expires.
Let's just assume it's a withheld.
Yeah,
And they were thinking about listing this year, so you collected maybe agency, the contract, KWPR, disclosures of affiliated business, and then your withheld form. And then they decide for whatever reason not to.
just the listing contract. Okay. Yeah, as long as we just have all those other forms on it, they're just information only, they don't necessarily have starter and date.
Because that comes up a lot with buyers, I feel too.
Yeah.
We've had several buyers who tried buying last year,
Yes.
and now their buyer reps have expired, but they're out shopping again.
Yes, I'm totally okay with just the buyer rep.
Just the buyer rep.
Okay, all right, well, let's get started again. So in a listing, and I alluded to this earlier, and Stacy and I were just talking about it, you have to remember that sellers, well, all consumers march to the beat of their own drum. Some of them are very loyal, some of them are like super competitive shoppers, always searching for the best rate and the best deal. And so the sooner you can sign a listing contract, the better, because that establishes a legally binding contract and a commitment to work with you. So even if you come upon someone who says like, well, you know, I don't want to sell until after my kids are like past their, summer vacation. But, I'm trying to get my ducks in a row and I'm trying to do my research. If you can get them to sign a listing contract right now that will protect you from, the bridal shower that they're at in June 1st, where they learn that their, best friend from church's mother is also a realtor or something like that. So the sooner you can sign a listing agreement, the better. But there is a tool for you that says like, hey, though we commit to working with one another to the listing, we acknowledge that it is not going to be actively for sale on the Northstar MLS until at least this date. So that's what's called withheld. So you can do a withheld Northstar MLS listing. You sign all the documents that we've already gone through plus this form. Keller Williams Preferred sends it to the Northstar MLS, and they're kind of the holders of this data. They're sort of like the referees saying, Edina Realty can't now send in a listing agreement on this address because Keller Williams Preferred already has it. So you would put in the address here, you'd put your name on there, you would do the date that the contract, the listing agreement was dated, started, and signed. Ideally, all three of those dates will be the same, though I think I neglected to mention that then. You put in the contract end date, county, the PID number, what type of property it is, and then they sign it and you also sign it. This means kind of indefinitely, except if you need to extend the contract expiration date, that they commit to working with you, and it's called withheld. When it's within the withheld listing, if any of you guys noticed my post last Friday in the Facebook group and also on the Friday email, when it's in the withheld status, you can say, hey, fellow realtors here at Keller Williams Preferred Realty, I've got this amazing lake property that's withheld. And if you have someone looking at lake property, we could go there and we could look at it together. It's not market ready. They're not even totally sure that they want to sell it, but we put this, $2 million price on the listing and let's go look at it. What you can't do is say on Facebook, hey, Facebook friends, I've got this great listing that these people are thinking about selling for $2 million on the lake. You cannot do any public advertising, but you can do all kinds of individual personalized advertising. You can tell those of us here in the office, that's where every week each time at the team meeting, we say, does anyone have any withheld listings? That's the point of that. You could even say to your friends over at Coldwell Banker and Edina, we're at our Thursday bowling league and we're talking about business. So we say, I'm super excited, I've got this lake listing, and you can show it to them. You cannot put a for sale sign in their yard, you cannot do Facebook advertising, but you can spread the word, which is the opposite of coming soon. Go ahead.
you know if I'll need to do this twice then, for like the MLS and then the RASM?
You will.
Okay,
Which is why some people decide to do just one or the other,
yeah.
but really in the best interest of your seller, it's best to do both. So then there's something that is the opposite of this. This is the coming soon authorization. So in coming soon, you actually can publicly market the heck out of it. You put your for sale sign in the front yard, you put, run Facebook ads every day, you put it in your church bulletin, you can advertise it to whomever you want, but you cannot show it. So no one is allowed to go within that house during a coming soon status, or there are serious fines for it. And I think the fines are listed here. It could be $1,000 fine assessed to the listing agent. And you know how that's determined, right? I mean, just kind of follow me along here. It's a coming soon, there's a for sale sign in the front yard. You as the realtor park in the driveway with your friend and you go into the house, and who's out for a walk, walking their little Yorkie? But that Edina Realty agent who lives down the corner and around the block, and they know your car and they know you, and they just saw you walking in the house with someone else. Well, maybe you were walking in with a photographer, maybe you were walking in with a stager, but you never know who's got a drone flying overhead because they're watching the ice go out on the lake or something silly. Do not show a house during the coming soon status, all right? So both of these forms get submitted to the North Star MLS, who I said is the referee. This also gets submitted to the North Star MLS, and it's called the Single Family Residential Input Form. I skipped over the showing instructions form because I feel like that's something that you'll figure out when it comes, but it's long and it's detailed and it's kind of long. But what's most important on the Single Family Residential Input Form are these 12 statements that say, by signing the authorization section below, the seller acknowledges the following. The seller's broker is a participant in the Regional Multiple Listing Service. You as the seller have authorized the broker to give this information to the MLS. Once the information is given to the MLS, it becomes their property. They can syndicate it, so on and so forth. So to an owl, you could read all of that to them. Most people just say, yep, I understand, I'm committing to putting my house on the multiple listing service with you as the real estate brokerage. So it's signed by the seller, it's signed by you as the realtor, and it must be dated the date that the listing contract starts and the date that the listing contract ends. If you forget this form for some reason and you say like, oh shoot, this listing contract was dated April 10th, but now it's April 12th and I had forgotten to get this to you, it is okay to, there's not like a date on here. It is okay to have an electronic signature dated a little bit later, but it is always in your best interest to have all these forms dated at the exact same time that the listing contract starts, because you are required by North Star MLS to have it to the North Star MLS within 48 hours. If you don't, you can receive fines for that. And it happens where you sign a listing contract unexpectedly with that bull who says, yep, let's pull it out right now. Then you go to your kid's birthday party, then you go to a cocktail party, then the next morning you're volunteering at church, and before you know it, you're like, oh my gosh, it's a couple days past and I totally forgot to turn this in, and that is a problem. So you have to make sure that time is of the essence. I'm not going to go through every line of the family residential input form, and I'm going to strongly encourage you don't do that with your sellers either. It puts too much responsibility and pressure on them. If you're working with a personality type that really likes these details, sure, you can go over it together, but make it best practice to not necessarily go over all of it with them, but do give them a copy of it once you've filled it all out completely, because if they want to proofread it, they can. What's important for you to know is this top right box right here that says anything, any number that is indicated with a black box is required, and anything that is a black oval is also required. The black ovals are required only if it's a comp sold, and anything that's in white is optional. So for example, white boxes down here would be things like, Some that are optional that I think could really help you would be, here we go, amenities in the unit. So if you're selling a condo and within the unit, there's actually tile floors and there's a washer and dryer right within the unit, your job is to help the seller market their house to the best of your possible ability. And so giving more information, the better. It's really, really a good idea to fill out as thorough of a listing input form as you possibly can. Now, is it required? No. Is it something we ask of you as experts and professionals here at Keller Williams? Yes, it is. When it comes to the last page of the listing input form, I also request of you to be incredibly thorough. And this is just how my brain works, so do it in whatever order you wish, but this can be a maximum of 1,000 characters. I want you to use all 1,000. We are marketers, we are professionals, we are experts, and we want this house to look as amazing as it possibly can. So sure, could you say there's a main floor formal dining room? Yes. Or could you say, envision enjoying your life, hosting meals while gather around the table of this sun-filled formal dining room. Yeah, like give some detail here. This is also a helpful spot to put things that aren't necessarily going to be visible on the photo. So you can say things like, the roof was recently redone using blah, blah, blah type of shingle that has a blah, blah, blah type of warranty. Now, some people will just copy the public remarks and put it up here in the agent remarks. I find that, just personal opinion, to be quite lazy. The agent can read the public remarks, so it doesn't make any sense to have two of the exact same paragraph right here. If there's things that you want the agents to know, you should put that there. So like in one of my recent listings, I said the shelves that will be at the showing and in the photography that are in the formal dining room and in the office are excluded. Other things that you can put in here would be, you know, I don't need to go through it in the interest of time, but things that you want just the realtors to know, not necessarily something that you want to have as like flowery marketing language. Then additionally, if there are any financial comments that you need to, and it can't be promotional or marketing things, but if there are any financial remarks, this is the spot for it. So if your condo or your townhome complex does not allow FHA financing, this is a great spot to call that out. It would be obvious, I did not check it on the listing input form, so therefore it's not on the listing, but I want to make it crystal clear. Or the townhome is currently under a financial assessment of, you know, a certain number of dollars per unit, for example. Anything that has related to do with financing could go in there, and it could be an easier way to call it out to your fellow realtors so they know what they're getting into as they prepare to show your listing. So that is the listing input form, and I'm not gonna lie, it's my least favorite. How about you? It's your least favorite? Least favorite. I put so much pressure on myself on it, and it's just like, oh snap, that's how I feel about listing input forms. Okay, let's see here. This is so fast. It's so slow. Amy, do you have any questions?
No, I'm just following along here. Great training, by the way. Thank you.
Oh, good. Yes, my pleasure. Tell me what you did before real estate while we wait for this to load.
Oh, sure. I was a team manager for the last 7 years for a small team with Remax Advantage Plus. And I know Ryan O'Neill, he was the broker there. And I can relate to your story as I started out in, I bought my first home a few years back, and I started working for the builder, Pulte Homes, showing model homes. And so that kind of started out my real estate career, and I just fell in love with helping people get the home of their dreams. And I've worked in the business since. So. Mm-hmm.
Oh, good for you. Do you live here in the South Metro?
I live an hour and a half south of the Metro right now. Actually, during the pandemic, I moved south, but I had lived in the Metro many years prior. So, yeah.
Cool. Are you an urban farmer? Do you live like in the country to get away from it all? Are you living out
No,
there?
I would love that, but no, I don't live in the country, so.
Got it. Okay.
Yes.
Next, we go on to the seller's property disclosure. So this is a form that, no matter your personality type, I really want you to pretend you're an owl. I want you to read this. I want you to study this. With every seller that provides it to you and with every buyer who's about to make an offer on a property, I want you to literally read this line by line. This is not something to be taken lightly. In the small amount of times in the last year as the broker here that I have interacted with the Department of Commerce, with the Association of Realtors Code of Ethics Board, or with arbitration hearings, this is something that is come back to time and time again, that either they were thorough or they were too brief, and if you're too brief, you are accused of having not properly disclosed things. So it is incredibly important for both buyers and sellers that they fill this out to the very best of their ability. I highly recommend when doing your very first listing appointment that you bring that agency relationships and real estate disclosure, and that you also bring this property disclosure, that you just leave them both at their house blank, and you say, hey, you know, you're gonna be feeling like, I'm excited to sell my house, what can I do to really get the ball rolling? Pull this out, pour yourself a cup of coffee, pull this out, fill it out as best you can, then sleep on it, maybe even for a week, because I assure you, you'll be brushing your teeth or you'll be in the shower and you'll be like, oh my gosh, I totally should have put that on the seller's disclosure form. I forgot all about it. So this isn't something that you should just fill out in a rush in 10 minutes the day you decide to list your house. This should be something that you really are thinking about and that you really fill out thoroughly. Fortunately for you, there is something called an amendment to the disclosure statement. So if it comes up to you after you've already put this out to all prospective buyers, if it's something that happens, you know, there's hail damage or something between the time that you've put your house under contract to sell it and the time that you closed it, or if there's something that's found by the buyer in their home inspection that you didn't really even realize, we are absolutely going to want you to amend this disclosure statement. And it's just a simple one-page form right here. I don't feel like this form gets used enough, but it's something that really should be utilized. So again, I'm not gonna go over that disclosure statement line by line, but I can tell you, I want you to be as thorough as you possibly can. Now, there is an option for sellers, and it doesn't just have to be used by what's commonly perceived as just by people who don't live there. Any seller who wants to can waive their right to provide a full disclosure, but they must then do the seller's disclosure alternative, which they could check right here that the written disclosure required may be waived if a seller and a prospective buyer agree in writing. The seller and buyer hereby waive the written disclosure under the state statute, and you can merely have the seller check here. Most often, if a person who's lived there for quite a while does a seller's disclosure alternative, the buyers and the buyer's agents are gonna say, why? Like, that doesn't seem right. This raises a red flag. This raises my eyebrow. I'm not sure that I'm comfortable with this, and I encourage you as the buyers to not necessarily be comfortable either. So where this is used most often is that group of kids who I was describing earlier who might be helping mom sell the family farm, where she's not, you know, doesn't have all of her mental capacities anymore and is incapable of remembering all the things that they may have done to this family farm over the last 80 years. Another option is a seller could hire a home inspector to do a very thorough property inspection. They could give a full copy of the property inspection report with this disclosure, and you would check line 1 here then to say this inspection was prepared by Matthew Brown at Home Site Inspections. It was done on this exact date. Seller discloses all material facts known by the seller, anything that contradicts the inspection report, and anything that wasn't even addressed in the inspection report. So those are kind of like 3 options to disclosure. What you cannot avoid, even if you do seller's disclosure alternative, is if you have a septic system, if you have a well, if you are a foreign individual, or if you know that methamphetamine was produced on the property, or if you know of a radon issue. So those are just a handful. What is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things that cannot be waived. So those have to be disclosed by all sellers, no matter the circumstance. And it's very easy to disclose that even if you are the kids of this older woman, you would say, yep, absolutely, there's a septic system there, we fully know that. Yes, absolutely, there is not a well there, we fully know that. I fully know that she has her residency or does not. You could also say that you are not aware of any methamphetamine produced at the property. If you didn't live there, you wouldn't have known that. I haven't actually, interestingly, received ever a property disclosure where the seller was aware of methamphetamine production on the property, but if you know, I guess you know. And then also the radon is very easy here. Either they have or they have not conducted a test. Either there is or there is not a mitigation system. We also have to just go over, and this is in the property disclosure and the disclosure alternative, we have to let them know if they're in an airport zone. We have to have discussed that at least. It is by state statute required that every sleeping space within 10 feet has a carbon monoxide detector. So sellers of all different types need to be aware that this is not our best practice suggestion. This is state law in the state statute 299F.51. There isn't necessarily anything in terms of disclosure from lines 138 to 166. It's a little bit more just educational that says studies have shown that various forms of water intrusion may affect homes. Water intrusion may occur from exterior. It can also occur from interior moisture damage. And here are some examples of both interior and exterior problems. Fungi that is present can cause poor indoor air quality, and so people need to be educated on this. Of course, it can be very, very bad for your health. We talk again about the predatory offenders here, and then the seller hereby authorizes any party to present this to interested buyers. And the sellers will sign here on line 194, and then not until a buyer makes an offer on the property will the buyer sign on line 293. We don't need to sign it as the realtors, it's just the buyers and the sellers, but it is important to give all buyers and sellers education on radon and real estate transactions, and it's outlined on these 2 pages here from the Minnesota Department of Health. Any questions about seller's disclosure or seller's disclosure alternatives?
My only question is, I think you said at the beginning that it's really important that the agents look through it. I have heard some agents say, that because the agents aren't supposed to touch the seller's disclosure, that only the sellers themselves are supposed to fill it out, that they give them specific instructions on how to fill it out, but they don't necessarily read through every line to see what they marked. But it sounds like you're saying that we as agents or as admins who are helping our agents should in fact make sure to read everything that they've marked, because if something is filled out either incorrectly on there, which happens a lot on that page 4,
Yes.
especially where they mark something isn't working,
Totally.
but it's just that it's not
Isn't
actually
there.
a part of the property. Or like if they were to mark something, I don't know, like maybe that meth thing or the radon thing where we might need to talk with them a little bit more about what that means.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked. So that seller's disclosure would be very tempting to just fill out for them. Like, I know all these things already to be true. I've been to the house multiple times. But it does say very specifically that the seller themselves must fill it out. It can't be filled out by anyone else. It can be done electronically, so you can send it to them to modify this electronically, which is kind of nice. It can also be done just in pen and paper and they can write on it. But I am of the belief that yes, you should review it, and if there's things that you notice on there that don't seem to line up, bring it to their attention and ask them to revise it, potentially just put in a new page, maybe have them sign it and initial it, or cross it and initial it if it's done after the property disclosure has already been distributed on the MLS. But things that I see that are kind of commonly mistaken is, do you know the type of title evidence? Well, if it's not really an abstract, if they don't have an abstract, you shouldn't let potential buyers or realtors believe that, because some people may be history buffs and say like, I totally want a copy of that abstract. So that's mistaken a lot. It also is really important, we check this in our auditing to make sure that the home is suitable for year-round use. And then I've had a couple situations where the property does include a manufactured home and they haven't properly noted that, and that will greatly impact their mortgage. And then what Stacy, if it's a mobile home, if it's not a traditionally built house, it's almost impossible to get a mortgage on it. But what Stacy mentioned, and I'm glad that you encouraged me kind of to come back, is this page 4 asks 3 questions. Does it exist in the property, and is it in working order or not in working order? So like, for example, someone may say like, oh, dang, no, I don't have a central vacuum. Like your brain just goes to central vacuum, no, right column. But the truth should be either you have a central vacuum, yes, or you don't have a central vacuum, not applicable. If you have a central vacuum, which are so rare now, and you haven't used it since 1985, although I have a central vacuum in my house built in 2020, so I'm kind of old school like that, clearly. But if you haven't used it and the parts and pieces aren't working, then that would be where you say, no, it is not working. Just like, oh yeah, there is a ceiling fan there, but it hasn't worked for the last 6 months. So it's really, really important for you as the agent to avoid any sort of confusion to make this very crystal clear. Now, another situation that I ran into that I think is worth talking about is we represented a seller. The seller of the house had a pool. The pool was sold and closed in, let's just say, like March. The pool was not yet opened. The pool wasn't running. Well, that pool and equipment happened to have a heater. Well, they never turned on the heater in the entire time that they lived there, so they didn't know whether the heater was working or wasn't working. So they just said, is the pool and all of its equipment working? Yes. It doesn't say anything about here about a pool heater. Well, we got into quite a debate after closing because the seller had said, yes, my pool and equipment are working, and the buyer said, no, your pool heater is not working. So you as the realtor with expertise from yourself and from collaboration here at the Market Center could be thinking about these kinds of things, could be protecting your seller to say, hey, I love your pool. Obviously, I can't see it aside from the pictures that you have sent me. But tell me more about that pool and all the equipment. Like, does the little cleaner in the bottom work? Yeah, totally. It works great. We have to replace it every couple of years, but it works great. Pool cleaner then is working. Yes. How about your pool heater? Do you use the heater? Is the pool cover working? So that's where you just really have to get incredibly thorough. And the more you disclose, the better. Does that answer your question? I absolutely want you checking it, correcting it. Yeah. But you can't fill it out for them. Right. You can kind of prompt them, but you can't fill it out for them. Okay, if a house was built prior to 1978, there is a possibility that underneath those multiple layers of hot pink and bright white and mustard yellow and then dark gray and now bright white again have some lead in them in the way that the paint was made before 1978. And so you have to make sure and provide to your seller this form, which then you and the seller sign, that says either the seller has no knowledge or records of any lead-based paint, or yes, it has been passed down to them, or they've done the research on their own. Most often, the seller is going to say they have no knowledge of it. The rest of the form is just left blank because then when an offer is made, the buyer's agent will take from your property disclosures, which technically you're supposed to put this out before a buyer has to fill in blank on themselves. And they're going to say, yep, I am very concerned about lead and I'm going to conduct this 10-day, I'm going to conduct a risk assessment within 10 days, or no, that's not super important to me, I'm going to waive it. But it is super important to me during auditing that the sellers and the realtors and the buyers all sign this form. I kick this back every now and then because you send this out for electronic signing, you don't have any other signatures except for this one, so you just send it to the seller, you forget about it, and then it comes back to me and it's not been signed, and it is really important that you do it. It is a disclosure that is mandated and regulated. So now let's pretend the house you're selling has a well, a septic system, let's see well and septic system. So let's pretend that the house has a well. They're going to be, you're going to want to provide to your seller, if going to a listing appointment, you know that there's a well and a septic system. You're going to want to provide this to them, just like I suggested with the seller's disclosure statement, well in advance of the listing. Because this is going to take some research. This is going to take some time. And like the seller's disclosure, you can guide them along, you can help them and point them in the right direction of where to get all this information, but technically, again, it really is supposed to be filled out by them. So it asks some pretty hard questions, like, if this is a shared system, how many residences does it serve? Well, they're probably gonna have to go out for a walk and count that, because they might not remember how many are in their shared association. Who manages that well? Well, I don't know, the association does, but really ultimately, is it Hartman Well Service? Is it, another local company? Do they know when their shared well, or they would know, I'm sure for themselves, when the last time was that property water was tested? And if it's not in use anymore, was it sealed? Who sealed it? Is there a well number on it? They're gonna have to research and find all that information. Likewise with the septic system, it asks quite a few questions. I am asked quite frequently.
Melissa, my big question with well and septic is, when I see those filled out, a lot of the times when we're the buyer, the seller just didn't answer a lot of those questions.
That's a shame.
Yeah, and so I'm always so curious, like, and again, because it's a seller's market, I think that's why the buyers don't really push back.
Yeah.
But it always begs the question, like, how hard should our agents be pushing back on the seller's agent to say, hey, the seller hardly filled this disclosure out at all.
Hard. Push hard. They're being paid well and it's their responsibility.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
Because maybe they checked, just one box that they know that there's, they checked like the first box and they looked at the rest of the form and went, this is too hard to fill out, I'm not gonna do any of this.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, because it is hard, but it is essential. That's really, really essential. Now, what I thought you were gonna ask, and a lot of people ask me is, do you have to have a water test and do you have to have a septic certification? And you don't have to have either. It is determined upon the county in which your septic system is that determines if you have to have a compliance certification on the septic. It is going to be our buyer's sincere request, and we hope that a seller would comply that they do that, but they don't necessarily have to if it's not in the proper county. And then the water test is something that they can get at the county. They bring a water sample and they can bring it into the county. And again, in just following the golden rule, it is something that sellers should be providing. So if you're representing a seller, go the extra mile. Make sure that they've had their septic system pumped, make sure that they've had the certification, make sure that they've had the water tested, and just set them up to that is going to be your expectation. It may actually come through that it's not the request and the expectation of the buyer, totally up to the buyer, but prepare your seller for it.
If the buyer says in a competitive situation that they don't want to push the seller to send them that information because they don't want their offer to get turned down because they're asking for information that the seller hasn't provided, we can say it's in their best interest, but if they don't want us to ask for it, we also don't have to ask for it.
Correct. We have to be obedient. Yeah. Even if we as, I am my dad in that situation. I am like a mama bear owl, and I would say, you cannot buy this house unless you have it. But then I have to remember, if they're willing to take on the liability and the risk themselves, I have to be obedient to what they're comfortable with. The septic system is a little trickier even to fill out because it asks like, okay, what's the phone number of the installer? Well, my gosh, if this was installed in, 1974, it might be pretty hard to figure this out. What's the tank size? More commonly known, when was it last pumped? Where's the drain field location? It also asks how many people are in the house that is using the septic system, how many showers are taken a week, how many loads of laundry are done per week. I sometimes wondered why they don't include the dishwasher on it, but anyway, it's laundry water, so on and so forth. So again, the seller fills that out, we provide it to a buyer before they make an offer, and then when the buyer makes the offer, they send it back signing that they have received it. Need to take out? I did fix, all right, I'm really glad you came, thank you. I appreciate your investment of time. They are also going to be required, sellers are, to put a map together of where their well and septic system are. This literally can just be like a kindergarten-ish drawing. You're gonna draw a straight line, here's the street. Then you're gonna draw a line, here's the driveway. Then you're gonna draw a rectangle, even if the house isn't necessarily shaped like a rectangle, and say, this is approximately where the house is, this is approximately where the pole barn is, the well's in the front, the septic's in the back, kind of thing. It can be very generic. And the buyer and seller will both initial that. I really have no idea why it's not signed, but it's both initialed. So that covers it for well and septic additional disclosures. I'm going to just touch on a couple other things here. When listing a house, we ask that you, as the realtor, fill out this net sheet, and it has 3 columns for the purpose of, hey, we think, and we're listing your house at $200,000, but I want you, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, to know if your house sells for less or if your house sells for more. This is how the percentages all break out, and this is how it can impact what your bottom line is, what your estimated proceeds would be. This is actually a pretty complex form to fill out. If you use our standard forms, there's a lot of automatic valuations that will go in there. They're like, it's automatically calculated for you. There's a whole class on how to fill out net sheets, so be sure to attend that and then come to Jessica and I if you do a listing before you're able to attend the class. This is also a good time to remind you, do you guys ever go to the KWPR dashboard? Have you utilized that yet, Hannah? Good, okay, cool. KWPR dashboard. The KWPR dashboard has a ton of good stuff on it. Oh shoot, and it's not even coming right up. I think it is just literally KW, oh, I have that wrong, that's why. KWPR dashboard. There we go, perfect. So there's quick links, there's good references, and then what I wanna bring to your attention is I have recorded all of these forms in depth. And actually, there's someone here in the office whose name is Colin Manson, who's the one who did the net sheet. So you can go to the recordings of all of this and read it and listen to it and study it before you fill out all your documents, especially the net sheet. But that needs to be filled out at the time and the price that you listed at. It won't get listed without one. And it also needs to be filled out again at the time that you execute a purchase agreement. And you can leave the 3 columns and the 3 prices on there if you want to, but one of those prices has to be whatever the final contract sales price was. Now let's pretend that your family has come to you and they have said, hey, cousin Johnny is buying grandma's house. She's moved into the nursing home. We've prearranged this. All the siblings have talked about it. We're agreeing that this is what it's going to be. We're not listing the house per se. We just want to sell to this one individual. And maybe even Johnny says like, oh, I don't know that I totally want it, but I want to at least be able to come in and look at it. If there's going to be just a one-time showing, as it's called, and my example probably wasn't the greatest if it's between family, maybe let me change the situation. Let's say your friend has come to you and said, Granny has gone into the nursing home. My neighbor wants to buy the house. They've always loved the house, they wanna move back in. They don't wanna shop around, they don't wanna look at anything else, they just wanna come in and see the house. We're not comfortable just giving them a tour. We want them to be accompanied by a realtor. You would fill this out, which is essentially just exactly a listing agreement. You'll see that all of these lines are really very similar. We're talking about closing, we're talking about being a foreign individual, we're talking about electronic signature. So it is a listing agreement, but it's not to list on the MLS to be visible for everyone in the world to see it. This is just to be shown one time for the potential of this one buyer to see it. And it can actually be multiple buyers. That's why there's multiple lines on there. So that form is used in that instance and that situation. It's also really important to me, in my opinion, that you have your sellers sign to every single change that you make to their listing. Now, it's not required at Keller Williams that you do this in all these cases, but I think just to get yourself off on the right foot in the best practice, that you should have them sign every single time. So let's just say the house doesn't sell at 200,000 and you need to reduce it. You would do a listing price change and you would change the price down here, and that, of course, you would have them sign. Let's say that, Stacy brought this up before, let's just say that you worked with someone very analytical or a bull, and they said, I'm only gonna list my house with you for 2 months. And then in that 2 months, it didn't sell, or maybe it was withheld and it didn't even get on the market. You would change the date of your listing contract here by saying this is what the old expiration date was and this is what the new one is. You could also change the status of the listing where temporarily for a few days or a little while, they're not going to allow any showings. Maybe they're hosting Easter or having guests for the weekend or something like that. They could also elect to cancel the listing with you here, and this is how you cancel a listing agreement. And in that case, then required for cancellations, I need to sign it in addition to you and the sellers. If you're simply changing the status to pending, it's gone under contract and you're selling it, changing it to pending, it does not need to be signed, but I would love to see you have it be signed. I just had something come up this week actually where we changed a listing to pending. We put the agent's name in that presented the purchase agreement, and that worked through all of it, and then they let us know, oh, hey, by the way, I'm on a real estate team and I need this also to be shown in the MLS as having a co-selling agent with me. So this form would need to be signed and submitted to the North Star MLS for that. When a property is sold, the North Star MLS with asterisks here requires that we put in what the sales price was, the date that it closed, if there were any seller paid closing costs, and what the type of financing was on it. So again, this does not necessarily need to be signed for by the seller, but I strongly encourage you, any change on the MLS, to have your sellers do it, because if they come back to you and say, like, I didn't want it to show this way on the MLS, this would be a paper trail where you can prove that you've gone over it with them and that they signed agreement to it. I mentioned that you can amend the property disclosure. Likewise, you can also amend the listing agreement. So if you found out after the fact that the association does not allow FHA financing, you could sign this amendment to listing contract and that would allow you to change it. If you signed a listing agreement with one person and then discovered like, oh, this person is still married, they're not officially divorced yet, and you need to add another seller, you could use it for that. And then I have put this one in here. Most people would think of this as a form that you use with your buyers, but I think it's a good form to use with sellers too, because the seller is required to fill out a lot of information in regards to their association to then provide to the buyer. And so I think it's a good idea going into a listing appointment where you know that there's a common interest community to bring this with you and say, hey, I'm going to be asking all of this of you. You're gonna wanna tell me who your property management is, if there's a primary contact there, what their phone number, their email, and their website is. And I just want you to know they're likely gonna have to pay to receive all of this information, but this is setting the expectation of what I'm looking for from you. Then it's incredibly important when you're representing a buyer that you say, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, the sellers have provided all this information to you. I'm giving this to you now. You're gonna put your name and sign receipt of it here, because a horrible predicament to get into after closing with a buyer is for a buyer to say like, don't you know how much I love my Great Dane? You never told me that I couldn't have a dog of this size in this association. Having a receipt like that would allow you to go back and say like, yes, I did, and this is exactly when we talked about it. I'm sorry that you didn't read through it line by line, but I did give it to you, and this is exactly what it says. Okay, now I'm gonna switch over to the buyer bootcamp forms because you've gone through them already. I'm just gonna go through them incredibly quickly. A lot of it is duplicate, and so we're gonna go through that. So we've already talked about agency relationships in real estate. You do with buyers and sellers. A buyer representation contract is similar to a listing agreement. It has a start date, it has an end date. It is also not important to get their legal names here. Just any old name really is fine. It's incredibly important to let them know that you, as a realtor, receive compensation, typically of 2.5%, and that there is also this one-time broker administrative compensation of $4.99. that you are assisting them in purchasing a home that may be most likely for residential or personal use, but we recommend here at the brokerage that you check all of these boxes, just saying that, you know, hey, maybe they win the lottery and they decide to buy an investment property or something like that. Again, talking about whether they want to arrange the closing or if they give you permission to do that. Again, talking about how they may have some additional costs in addition to the commission. If the seller is a foreign individual, will they or will they not agree to dual agency? Again, all the same stuff about this is how we cancel our fiduciary responsibilities. We've potentially previously had agency relationships. Electronic signatures are just as valid. Again, you can put that 499 down here right above the signatures, or you can put it up in the top. I want to be respectful of your time. Oops. So if you guys need to leave and just simply want to leave, which I don't blame you, by all means you can step out. But the buyer representation contract is different. The disclosures and the affiliated business is exactly the same. There is something that's incredibly important to sign with all of your buyers, and that is this compensation disclosure. It's required by Minnesota state statute that we as the licensed professionals let the buyers and the sellers know how we're paid for each individual transaction. And this is letting them know that the seller is going to pay their 2.7%, so that they are responsible for it. It's coming from the seller in this case of this particular listing of this particular house. However, they, as the buyer, have to pay this $499. All right, so Amy, are you still on? Now, since we've gone over these before, I don't think.
I'm still on. Sorry, I had you on mute here and I couldn't get my button off here.
I just wanted to make sure that you knew that if you wanted to log off, you surely could.
Okay.
All of what we covered applies to both buyers and sellers, and then I just touched on this buyer representation contract and also the compensation disclosure for buyers. Everything else here, I will just breeze over if you want to hear, and if you want to log off, I respect your schedule because we are right at the time of our ending, so.
Great. Excellent training. I really appreciate all that you shared. So you're excellent trainer. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure. I can't wait to meet you in person sometime soon.
Me too. Thank you. All right.
Were there any forms from the buyer Bootcamp that you want me to cover again?
I think I'm set on those. I do have a question about one-time showing, because I have that with the lake property coming up. What else do I need to go over with the sellers?
So would you be representing the buyer or the seller?
The buyer, it's a property that's not listed. It's from a golden letter. And they're thinking about listing in a few months, but they're not quite ready, but they said they'd be willing to do a one-time showing for my buyer.
Perfect.
So
do you already have the buyer under contract?
no, I don't.
Okay, so it's going to be incredibly important for both parties that you do the agency relationships in real estate. Where you let them know you can represent a buyer, you can represent a seller, you can be a facilitator, you can be a dual agent. It's really important that you go over all that. And then I do think, because it's first substantive contact and you're showing a buyer of non-listed property, that you should get them to agree to a buyer representation agreement, and it could literally just be for a week or a month. It doesn't have to be forever, but they need to be clearly educated and understand, like, there's commission involved. I could potentially be entering into a dual agency situation, so giving them that education, I think, is really important. Then with the seller, you would just do that one-time showing agreement.
Do the one-time showing and just the agency.
That's all you have to do.
And do that. Okay.
Yeah.
And then if the seller's like with commission, is it standard 6%, or what if they want to negotiate? What would be, especially down where I'm at in the lakes area, it's kind of like, you know, those smaller towns.
Right, if they like it, you're going to need to go steps further, or you're going to need to go over that KWPR disclosure, you're going to need to go over the affiliated business, you'll potentially need to do, you know, facilitated agreements or representation for both. But I would say just kind of follow the bare minimum to get them in there, make sure that you disclosed everything that you can. And then if they like it, you're going to need to work with the seller to get property disclosure and all of the other things.
do all that stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, just to make sure I have all the first, what do you need in that situation? That's good.
Agency fire rep.
So, sorry to bother you.
No, no bother. Come on in.
So I think there's a little calendar snafu, so we'll be here in 15 minutes. They thought it was at 1,
Oh. I thought it was at noon.
so
Sorry.
that's
And
what
what is it?
The
Onward
onward
Friday.
class was scheduled for 12, but they thought it was 1, we thought it was 12, so they're on their way, they'll be here in 15 minutes.
Oh, good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry.
No, no problem.
Well, that's what the last.
That's good.
Yeah, good job. Yeah, good job. And it never hurts to like over disclose rather than.
Okay. Thank you.
Hey, Scotty,
Yeah.
I saw that you wrote, but I was kind of in constant motion.
Yeah, since then, they sent over the cancellation
Oh.
with no greeting whatsoever. They fired her. I feel really bad for literally everyone involved.
But thank God that you got it.
I know. Now we just gotta, so how, I have a knockoff version.
Binder. Oh, I like yours better.
Yeah.
Oh, I like
Mine's
yours.
like the comfy material, that's why I did it.
And yours is more stylish. This to me looks very dirty.
No pun intended, right?
Total pun intended. But I like the same.
So when can we like bug them, like how, because of course my client's like, when do I get the money? I'm like, we're at the mercy of the listing brokerage, refunding the money through trust funds. It's probably gonna be at least 3 to 5 days, and that's if they get on it right away.
And it's another Keller Williams.
Yeah.
Are those people, do you suppose, at the same leadership conference in the Jane? Yeah. So I would say realistically, like a week.
Yeah, so I'll give it a days, maybe on Friday, I'll reach out to that brokerage, just to, I'll find out, maybe the MCA, right? I'll find out who the MCA is.
Right,
Don't you do that research?
Yeah, because it's great. It's not-
Yeah, Vietnam.
He's still learning how players
Right
are.
right out of
And then-
Macon.
I'm just a big
Oh,
person, so-
okay, nice.
Yeah.
That's cool. Well, yeah, that's a good market down there too.
You from up here?
Yeah.
1099.
Down Valley.
He told me, but didn't give me phone numbers, and I was like, reply, any chance you have the,
Yeah.
I thought I have a puppy, because I was
How
like,
often do you see yourself come up here?
did you see my face? I was like,
At least twice in one,
Do you have
2
that?
meetings,
What's
and
that
meetings.
it's a square case, and this is the magnet that goes on my mouth. Yeah.
When your hand was over, I thought it was like a cassette tape.
Oh,
Yeah.
funny, I did have one of those once.
I love those.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
trying to do
mix tape,
stuff.
mix
And then,
tape.
and,
Recorded all the songs from a man.
Oh, totally.
I even, because we were high
No,
school
from
sweethearts,
Northern
broke
Iowa.
up, see,
Yeah.
well,
Saw
in
the
the
jacket.
junior
Yeah.
year, and then got back together 3 years after college, separate colleges.
Wow.
But I was in love with him our entire senior year when we were best friends and he was with somebody else. But I still wrote out the lyrics to Taylor Dane's Love Will Lead You Back. And so now I'm telling you, every time we go on a date or anything, it comes on the radio.
Online
It's so uncanny.
I don't know if
It's
you
gotta
have a
be
bigger
done.
pocket.
Because I'm like, I told you, love would lead you back. So it's kind of a running joke.
I just started talking about
You had to
a
be
guy out
stupid for a
there.
while.
I knew him from Chicago.
And it reminds me that I broke up in 10th grade to go out and see a basketball player.
Yeah, they'll have a little fun too. I can just picture myself though sitting at my big old stereo
Yeah.
and like
Waiting for the
listening to
song to come on,
DJ.
yes. Stop talking so I can hit record.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
They're gonna do it via Zoom.
Well, one.
Were they going to do
one
it in
big
person?
thing is just getting kind of network in the office.
Yeah.
And then.
I think actually it was their screw.
Yeah.
I'll just give you.
You think what?
It was their screw up.
Yeah. Oh, for
Yeah.
sure.
But.
Oh, you know what? Let me just log out of here.
How
How are you today?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm on talking.
Yeah.
Scotty's been doing it, so it's
Yeah.
good to get connected. Wow.
Yeah. We had the speech today, so that the paperwork was, that's what we're trying to figure out. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, hang on, this is recording now. And, oh, sorry, down
But
here.
then how long have you been?